Good morning, everyone. My name is Jared Morrison, and I'm an organization development consultant with the Learning and Development Unit in OSU Extension. And we welcome you in today to our series ACEL to Extension. I'm pleased to introduce my colleague from the ACEL side, Beth Flynn. Her and I have kind of led the planning of these efforts, so we appreciate you coming today. This has been a wonderful partnership between Extension and the Department of Agricultural Communication, Education, and Leadership, or ACEL, as you'll hear a lot of us say. And we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Shannon Washburn, the chair in ACEL today, to talk to us about teaching for the transfer of learning. So Shannon, I'll let you take it away.
Well, thank you, Jared. I really appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you, and I want to share with all of you how excited I am that this ongoing relationship between the department that I have the opportunity now to lead and Extension, that this partnership has been ongoing, and we greatly appreciate your support of what we do, and hopefully we have some things to offer you that are helpful with your work. So I think this is a great win-win opportunity for us, and I have spent an entire career working with a joint teaching extension appointment. So I very much appreciate what you all do, and look forward to continue opportunities to get to know several of you. I do recognize some names that were on my session a couple of weeks ago, and I appreciate you coming back. Those of you who did, or those of you who weren't able to be at that one, I believe, Jared, the recording is available there. It's not a prerequisite knowledge sort of thing, but you might hear me referring to some of those topics from my last presentation. A couple of things that I would like to set up before we get started here. I know with the weather and the snow and internet connectivity, for some of you, there may be problems using your video camera, but for those of you that's not an issue, I would appreciate the opportunity to see your faces. And so if you can turn on your videos, that would be helpful to me. I have spent my entire career teaching in some form or another, and my style of teaching is highly dependent upon feedback from my classes. So thanks a bunch for giving me that feedback as we go, if you can. The second kind of ground setting thing that I want to share here is we're going to spend an hour together. And in this session, I'm going to ask you to do a lot more work than I asked you to do in the last session. Maybe the way that I should phrase that is I'm going to ask you to get some things done that are on your to-do list that are related to the next presentation that you might have on your agenda. So I am going to ask you to think about what is your next educational delivery that you need to be preparing, because I'm going to challenge you to do some application of what we talk about related to that session during our time together this morning. And then the third thing that I'm going to just go ahead and put out there, you've got an hour. I'm going to ask you to focus on what we are doing, or find another time to just watch the recording later, rather than trying to multitask. So give yourselves permission to spend an hour thinking and learning and growing, but also applying what we're talking about to your work. So I'll try to set the stage for those opportunities for you to do some application as we go. So to jump right into our content this morning, one of the things that I really think is exciting about Extension is that so much of the time, the work that we do is delivered to a constituent group that needs the information right now. And the work that we focus on is really about changing practice, changing behavior, and really sustaining life. To use the college theme, it's what we do. We're engaging with our audiences for the purpose of helping them do something better. And so within that context and thinking about that framework for our work, I want you to think about the transfer of learning today, and we're going to get into some definitions about that. So um, hopefully I can get my slides to advance. There we go. The first thing that I really want you to dig into is I just want to ask the question, as you think about, before we get into transfer of learning, as you think about learning, how do you describe it? I know you've thought about it, but how do you define what learning is? And if you want to just drop your thoughts into the chat, I would appreciate some reactions to that question. What is learning? Oops.
All right, Shannon, we've got some feedback in there. We've got discovering new ways to do things, acquiring new knowledge or skills, when you can take information and apply it to in some way, acquiring information and applying it to your life. So a lot of that exploration, connecting with others on a specific topic, reflection on topics. So a lot of those kind of.
Great, great. So as you think about that question a little bit further, what's the last thing you learned? Do you remember the last learning experience that you had? And you don't have to answer that. I just want you to think about it. And then also reflect on, how did you know you had learned it? And what was that environment in which you learned? So for example, with this recent snow, I learned that, gosh, when there's 4 or 5 inches of snow on top of about an inch of ice on top of about an inch of snow, I learned that my snowblower doesn't work so well and that I've got to find a new way to break through that crust. That's an example of something that I learned recently. Had not experienced that before with my snowblower. But my point is, I learned because I needed to, right? I learned because I was in an experience that required some kind of an adaptation. And I think so often with the extension topics that we have the opportunity to share and to teach, our audiences come to us with a need to gain a new experience because they've encountered a problem or something isn't going the way they want it to, and they're looking to make a change. What a wonderful context for learning, right? So often when I think about learning, I think about the experiences that I have that give me a reason to acquire new knowledge, right? My toilet is leaking. I've got to find something on YouTube, or I've got to figure out a way to get a plumber to my house right away because I don't know how to solve this problem. I have this experience and I need new information. Or someone has asked me to present on something. I feel like I know a little bit about it, but I probably need to learn more to have the credibility to walk into, again, that experience and be able to sound intelligent. So, we have opportunities to learn all the time, but so often I think they're connected to experiences. So as we think about learning for transfer or the transfer of learning, here's what I'm really getting at. So really there's 2 ways that I think about the transfer of learning. One way that I think about it, and this is really more the focus of what I'm going to ask you to think through today, is attending a formal learning experience, such as an extension workshop or a class or a webinar, attending that formal learning experience and thinking about, where in my life can I transfer this new information that I have learned? What is the context in which I will take this new knowledge and apply it in my life? So that's the main way that I'm thinking today about transfer of learning. But here's another way we can think about transfer of learning as well. How often have we been in a situation where a lesson that we learned previously in one context came into our lives and we applied it in a slightly different situation. So for example, an encounter with an upset customer. Um, Boy, the last time that I dealt with an upset customer, here's how I approached that relationship. Here's how I attempted to solve it. It either worked or it didn't, but one way or the other, you learn something, right? So the next time you have an encounter with an upset client or customer, you draw from those lessons, you transfer that learning from the prior experience or the prior context to the next one. And so as we think about transfer of learning, I'm going to challenge you to really focus in on one or two of those sort of applications. And again, begin to apply these topics to a presentation or an educational setting that you have upcoming on your to-do list. So again, when we think about extension, when we think about extension, as I mentioned at the outset, a lot of times we're trying to think about how can we help our audiences change something about their lives. And very often what we're hoping to change is their behaviors. For those of you who have been around extension for a while, you might be familiar with this phrase, Casa Change. Has anybody nod if you've heard this before? Okay, so it's a fairly familiar thing. So the basic premise, and this goes back to some 1979 work by Claude Bennett, where he really, in Bennett's hierarchy, he kind of outlined as one of Casa Change as one of the components of his hierarchy of learning. But the basic premise is that before we can change behaviors, we have to change knowledge. We have to somehow influence people's attitudes. Very often we have to equip them with some skills that will help them think about modifying their aspirations or what they want to accomplish. And if we can really deal with those in that linear progression, first of all, introducing some knowledge that impacts their attitudes, that motivates them to acquire new skills, that then helps them realize I can do something differently, then we have set the stage for helping them modify behaviors. So it sounds like those are concepts that many of you are familiar with today. But the reason that I pull Casa Change into this topic is that very often for transfer of learning to happen, we have to in some way recognize that our audiences come to us with prior experiences, right? And those experiences are going to impact their ability to learn new knowledge. Those experiences are going to impact their attitudes about that new knowledge. Our prior life experiences and maybe some of the skills that we already possess will have an influence on our thoughts about whether I can or cannot acquire new skills. And ultimately, prior experiences certainly impact one's aspirations. And so to focus on Casa Change and to help you think about how prior experiences impact new opportunities to learn, I have a quick activity that I'm going to ask you to do. And for those of you who were in my last presentation, you may feel like this feels a little bit similar to an engagement activity that I tried last time. But what I'm going to do here, this is not the same thing. I'm going to ask you to find a sheet of paper to jot some notes down if you don't already have one. And I'm going to put a group of, I believe it's 12 words on the screen for a little bit of time. And I'm going to ask you to just jot down on your sheet of paper. Don't type this into the chat. Just jot these down, as many of the words as you can remember after they disappear from the screen. Okay, so in a little bit you'll see that grouping of words. Focus on them. Try to retain as many as you can, and then jot them down. Don't jot them down while they are on the screen though. Wait until they're gone before you start taking those notes. No cheating. Here we go. All right. Okay, time to jot. How many words can you write down? For those of you I can see, it looks like most of you have stopped writing. So I want to introduce a concept that I introduced last time. For most of us, our short-term memory has a finite capacity. Well, for all of us, our short-term memory has a finite capacity. For most of us, the number of pieces of information that we can store there is somewhere between 5 and 7 pieces of information. I gave you 10 on the screen. I was thinking it was 12, but it's actually 10. But take a look at your list and just tell me or drop into the chat, did you write the word sleep on your list? How many of you have the word sleep on your list? Okay. In most groups, about half to 2/3 of the group wrote the word sleep. And this is the actual grouping of words. Sleep is not on the list, but a lot of us associate many of these words with sleep. And here's my point. I'm not trying to make you sleepy. I don't see any yawning, so that's a good thing. Justin's had his coffee. That's great. For most of us, we try to contextualize new information within our frame of prior experience, right? And so when you see a group of words like this and you focus on them for a little bit, a lot of us will just automatically fill in the blank. As we try to make meaning of new information, we will put that meaning into the context of prior experiences. And so my point is, regardless of what information that you're presenting, such as this collection of information on the screen right now, regardless of what information you're presenting, we have to recognize that some of our learners are going to make their own meaning, and sometimes that will even mean that they will misinterpret the new information because their brains can't help but try to put things within a context. It's part of learning. The human brain is going to do its own categorization. And this is why something such as individual cultures and differences of personal experiences among diverse audiences can really create complexity in the learning experience, because we all bring our own frame of reference to the learning environment. And I think that's an important thing to think about as we really transition into thinking deeply about learning for transfer. So on the screen now, you have a model that is going to guide the next chunk of our time together. That is some work from Bowd and Walker in the late 80s through the mid 90s. Bowd and Walker were publishing a lot of work around this, and quite often it was picked up and utilized by some extension groups. So you may have seen this before. They actually were doing their work in Canada. Excuse me, they were doing their work in Australia. Got the wrong theorists here. But I want you to focus in on the components here. When we think about learning for transfer, what I've tried to emphasize up until this point in time together is that we have to think about who the learner is. Part of our own, so this first component related to preparation is related to our own preparation for the learning experience. And that's why I'm going to ask you to do some application here in a bit. We have to, as part of our preparation, think about what are the learner's prior experiences. But we also have to acknowledge that when our learners walk through the door or sit down to the webinar that we're presenting, they have some prior experiences that they bring that will influence their ability to learn. So as we are preparing for that, the more we can focus on what might this audience already know, what might their prior experiences already be, to make some assumptions about where they are when they come to you, that's going to be helpful for you. Bowd and Walker also introduced some French. So if you're not familiar with the phrase or the term milieu, milieu really is talking about what is the social context, recognizing that other people who are present in the learning environment are going to influence the learning. So part of preparation here is to think about, how can I influence the milieu that will impact my learners' learning opportunities? So how can I set the stage for the context and the environment? And then thinking about the skills and strategies. So moving forward then, and I'm going to try to make this fairly quickly, the learning experience itself. In the center here, we have to think about the personal foundation of experience is going to be the greatest influence on someone's readiness and ability to learn. Pretty common sense stuff. If they walk through the door for your session and they ran over their cat on the way, the beloved family pet was run over by the vehicle that brought them to that seminar, they're not going to be at the same readiness to learn as they would be had they not run over the cat, right? Sorry, that's a sad, horrible example. Just the first thing that jumped into my mind. On the flip side, if they encountered a major problem that is directly pertinent to the content of your presentation, the morning that they were getting ready and they experienced this challenge and they walk into your session, they bring those experiences with them. All of us do this, right? So we have to recognize the impact of that. But then the other piece of that person aspect is they also come to us thinking about their intent. Why did they decide to show up? Why did you decide to show up this morning? Other than, you need another Zoom experience in your life. I don't think that was the case. You brought to this session some intent for wanting to be here. So again, recognizing and giving your audience an opportunity to think about, why am I here? What do I want to get out of this is going to be important. And then the person is going to notice their experiences with others within this broader milieu of the learning environment. And we also are going to intervene in the learning of others. And you are going to intervene as the presenter, you will intervene in their learning. Finally, the last stage here is really helping our learners, after new ideas have been presented, drawing their attention back to those prior experiences. How can we mentally, at least, transport them back to a time when they tried something, to focus on that prior experience, but then pull in the new content or the new knowledge that they've recently acquired? How can we help them think through how they feel about that new knowledge in the light of their prior experiences to make meaning and application of that? And then how can we help them reevaluate what those prior experiences might be within the context of this new information? Okay, so I've been talking a really long time. I'm going to ask you to focus on this first piece. And first of all, share your reactions to the focus on learner. What are your prior experiences with preparing for an educational setting where you focused on the needs of the learner? Or what are your experiences that you have had as an educator where maybe a learner's prior experiences influenced their ability to learn? So think on those questions for a minute. And then I'm going to ask if someone would be willing to share an example. Have any of you had an experience where you intentionally focused on learners' prior experiences and did that work for you? Or does somebody have an example of how you noticed that in a learning environment, your learners brought prior experience that impacted their ability to learn? Anybody willing to share an example?
I can share.
Great, thank you.
No, sure. So my experience is with younger kids. So my experience has more to do with feelings. So the younger kids you would know how maybe their morning went or their morning was going based on how that first activity was playing out sometimes. So sometimes, of course, it was the planner and the teacher's issue in a poorly planned activity. But my example would be with younger kids. Sometimes their feelings are always in the room, like you're saying. So they kind of brought those feelings and those experiences of maybe having an argument with mom or dad into that first activity, and it had an effect on their learning for the first couple hours of the day.
Yeah, Tyler, thank you for sharing that example with youth learners, because here's the difference between adult learners and youth learners related to this idea, in my opinion. Youth learners have not developed the ability to mask those emotions. That's the only difference. Adult learners bring the same emotional baggage with them to the learning environment, but we are pretty good after years of practice at masking those emotions. They still impact us. And I think that's an important thing to remember. So it's not just the emotional piece though, is it? Adult learners also have more life experiences to draw from. And so there's another big difference. And for that reason, youth learners oftentimes, I believe, come to the learning opportunity with a lot more enthusiasm for the new learning, simply because more things are a new experience. Nancy, I see that you've got your mic on. Did you have an example you wanted to share?
Sure. Working with 4-H adult volunteers and their level of experiences, you're having a training and you bring in and you have experienced club advisors, and then you have those newbies, and it's sometimes hard to teach to the whole range of experiences that you have in the room.
So have you encountered experiences where those more experienced volunteers were beneficial to the newbies?
Right. So those are the ones you ask to share experiences that they've had, maybe in a club setting or working with parents or working with, 4-Hers, and have them, I always, when a newbie or a new volunteer asks, well, how do I handle this? I always pull on my volunteers that have experienced that and ask them to share their experiences with the new volunteers.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. The tougher question, though, I'm going to ask you to think about reality. Have you ever experienced a situation where the more experienced people shared an example or an experience that ran counter to what you were trying to accomplish with your group of volunteers? Does that happen?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And then you spend your time analyzing the situation and saying, well, okay, that's not best practice,
Right.
So we talk about best practices and how you would handle that then. So yes, oh yeah, and that's the thing, when you ask for people to give examples, it may not always be, a lot of times it turns out not being what you wanted them to say.
Right. And I think I asked that question, Nancy, because I know that all of us who have any experience working with volunteers or working in an educational setting, you never know what you're going to get when you ask for the example. You never know what kind of prior experience the learner is going to pull in. But what we have to recognize is that is their prior experience, good, bad, or indifferent. whether it aligns with what with the direction we are trying to take them or not, that is their prior experience. So we have to acknowledge that. So I'm going to ask you to spend 2 more minutes here thinking about an upcoming educational experience that you need to plan, and really focus in on what are the learner experiences that you can anticipate are going to walk into the room. So think about, in your preparation, think about who your audience will be and what might their prior experiences be that will influence your instruction. We'll take 2 minutes, and then we'll come back to a larger group. So as you're wrapping up those thoughts, one of the things that I would challenge you to do is to not only analyze those prior experiences and think about them for the purpose of informing your preparation, but also think about how can you ask your learners to pull in those prior experiences? What can you intentionally do as a facilitator of learning to ask your participants to draw from those prior experiences? Maybe not necessarily will it be valuable for them to share them with the broader group, but in what way will you intentionally ask them to focus on those anchors that they have for learning this new knowledge? Okay, transitioning here. With this next activity, I'm going to ask you to focus on the learning experience itself. And this is where what I just said about asking your learners to pull prior experiences in and to really connect with their personal foundation of experience, as Bowd and Walker talk about. I'm going to ask you to, I'm going to ask Jared if he will help us put groups of about 3 people together. And I'm going to ask you to have a quick conversation about doing this within the process of learning, within the learning experience. How can we ask our learners to notice their own experiences, to engage with those experiences, and connect them with other people within the broader context? And it doesn't have to be in a face-to-face environment, but what can we do to help facilitate learning from other people's experiences as well as learning from our own? So Jared, have I stalled enough to give you time to build groups? Let's spend 3.5 minutes in conversation in a group of 3, just talking about experiences that you've had pulling in those learner experiences to the learning environment. Are we good, Jared?
Yeah, I'm sorry, did you say how long?
Let's spend 3.5 minutes.
Okay. I'm sorry, I've actually got 4 in a room.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine.
People move.
No worries. Thank you for helping with that.
All right, I will send you there now.
Thank you.
Thanks.
For some reason, Jared,
Mm-hmm.
when I am sharing my screen, I can't see the chat. It's the weirdest thing.
Yeah, I've had other people have shared that too. I'm I have to look a little deeper into why that is, because there are times in my system where it gets hit
It goes
behind.
behind. Yeah,
Yeah. And I have two monitors.
I do
Usually
too.
I didn't move it, but it when you're in the middle of it, it's hard to find and
Yeah,
move.
well,
Yeah.
so for me, I think it's behind it's on the monitor. The chat is going to the monitor where my PowerPoint
Where you're
is.
sharing. Yeah.
And so the screen that I'm sharing is hiding the chat.
Yeah. You're probably right. I have had that. I mean, if you want to try to stop your share right
Yeah.
now and move it. Yeah, I've done that too.
I have found that when I come back from a breakout room, I can see the chat box again if I lose it before. But
Oh, really?
yeah, and I don't know why it pops up. Or maybe I've continued the share, but it automatically pops back up
Interesting.
because I have the same issue, Shannon.
Yeah, it's not working. Once I share,
It just keeps going behind.
it keeps going behind. And not only that,
Do you use full screen mode? Are you in full screen Zoom, or are you just maximized on your window?
I thought I was, I think I'm in full screen. Yeah, I'm in full screen.
Okay, so I do not use full screen.
Okay.
It seems to give me better, a little more control. It does, like you said, it still does occasionally get hidden behind what I'm sharing, but it does seem to let me move it like to the other screen better, if that makes sense.
Okay.
The other thing is in your PowerPoint,
Yep.
if you go to the slideshow and set up slideshow and click browse by an individual window, that might help also.
Browse by an individual window.
Yeah, in the slideshow setup, at the top of in your PowerPoint at the top, it says slideshow.
Okay.
And then let me do one. And then if you click on slideshow, about just to the left of that, it says setup slideshow.
Yep.
And if you click that on, it says show type is the first section.
Yep.
And if you click on browse by an individual window, that helps too.
Great.
Somebody from the hospital shared that with me at the workshop.
Perfect. That did it, because it was giving the two screen thing. Yeah, so I'm gonna share again here.
I think they're coming back.
Right.
Just a couple seconds.
I think that may have done it.
Can you see the chat box?
Nope, it's gone again.
What if you it was gone when, so maybe try clicking on chat again.
Oh, well. Welcome back, everybody. Hopefully you had a chance to kind of reflect a little bit and think about your own application as well of drawing from learner experiences. The last piece of our model is really that reflection. And this is where when we during the last session that I presented for ACEL 2 Extension, I focused on this concept that less is more, right? So it's not enough just to present new information. We also have to create opportunities for learner reflection. I think this is especially true for adult learners who need the opportunity to connect with that new content. And if we want to teach for transfer, we have to provide time very close to the acquisition of new knowledge. We have to provide that time for reflection. And that is thinking about your prior experiences within the context of this new knowledge that we've shared today, how might this work for you? Where might you use it? How do you feel about this? Not just whether you think it will work or not, but have you tried something like this before? Again, connecting to experiences. How might this new idea, regardless of what the content is, how might this new idea impact something that you do in your life? So that's the reflection process. And I want you to spend some time again now thinking about that upcoming session that you have to present and applying this reflection. How can you build in some opportunity for learner reflection during that upcoming session? So spend a couple of minutes thinking through that, and we will move on to some new ideas. Who has a question about this concept of building reflection in? Can I clarify anything with that? I want to share a caution. Sometimes reflection is the last thing we think about. I'm going to encourage you to not just wait until the last 10 minutes of the presentation to give your learners an opportunity to reflect. And here's why. Very often, when it seems like all of the new content has passed and now there's free time just to think, where often do brains go? Is it really on the reflection? Grace, what are you thinking?
Lunch. Lunch is next.
Yes, yes, it's exactly. When we give that thinking time, when we don't give any thinking time at all during the learning experience until the very end, then whatever we want the thinking to be about is not what the thinking is actually about. It is what is next in my day. I wonder what emails have come in since I started this. I wonder if the cat is recovering. Whatever that might be, they are not thinking about the thing that you will ask them to think about very often. So building in reflection throughout the learning experience is going to make that reflection much more likely to be applicable. And I would also venture to guess that during some of the breakout time that I gave you, just a few minutes at a time here and there to do some thinking, I'm guessing that in spite of the amazing instructor I am, not all of you use that time constructively related to the content. I'm betting there was some email checking, there was some text messages sent, there was something else that distracted you. So we have to acknowledge that. It's going to happen. But we also need to make sure that people have those opportunities because they're not going to be able to acquire new knowledge without the opportunity to put it within context. So along those lines, advanced slide, along those lines, what are some things that we can do to facilitate that? And this is maybe a bit less theoretical than thinking through this last model, and maybe a few more practical strategies for facilitating learning for transfer. Ultimately, what we want to do, if we want our learners to transfer new knowledge into a life experience, we have to think about what strategies we can use to effectively convey that information. And so two big ideas that I also want to introduce here is the concept of the primacy recency effect. This is, again, some brain-based learning that I think is really important for educators to think about. First of all, the primacy effect. The primacy effect suggests that the very first thing that we introduce within a new learning experience, the first concepts will be retained the longest. The primary ideas that are presented. In other words, think about the first 10 minutes of your session. The most important information that is most likely to be retained after the learning experience is going to be what happens in the first 10 minutes. And a lot of times we make the mistake of focusing too long on learner stories in those first 10 to 15 minutes of the learning experience. And we spend too much time setting the context and don't get into the meat of the presentation early. Another way to think about the primacy effect is to think about journalistic writing. When you're reading an article in the newspaper, the first couple of paragraphs get right to the point, don't they? If you want additional detail, you're going to have to read further into the article. But the real nugget, the meat of the idea, is right at the front. There's a reason for that in journalism, and there's a reason for that in education as well. The first 10 minutes of the instructional experience will last the longest in terms of learner retention. So think about how can you package your content in such a way that allows people to connect to their experiences very quickly, but then also get into the heart of the idea that you're presenting. The recency effect is kind of the opposite. The thing that is most recently discussed is going to be on people's minds first of all. So when I ask a question at the end of this session about what ideas you really are going to walk away from, some people will talk about things that I discussed in the first few minutes. The other things that will come to mind are really what happened most recently, the last 10 minutes. So related to the primacy recency effect, I'm going to challenge you, and I'm sure you've heard these ideas before, but just a reminder, when we think about transfer for learning, the concept of the 10-minute rule in instruction, and Tyler talked about youth learners earlier. The 10-minute rule is especially true for younger audiences. But for all of us, if you remember, those of you who attended my last presentation, we don't pay attention to boring things. So for most of us, an idea or an instructional strategy that lasts more than about 10, 12, 15 minutes is going to eventually become boring and we will lose focus. So to think about your content and package it within chunks of 10-minute concepts, and then create opportunities for your learners' focus to shift between each 10-minute session. So I'm going to stop talking and let you work on something. I'm going to ask you to not read, but instead focus on this picture. I'm going to give you an opportunity to talk to each other. Those can be shifts in our mental focus that will allow us to regain attention. So this idea of chunking into 10-minute pieces, shifting learners' attention, and then after the shift, we have to hook them back and draw them back into the new idea so they're ready for the next chunk. This will allow us to take advantage of the primacy recency effect. They're going to remember the first 10 minutes, but they're also going to remember what happened most recently. So if their brains are still on the last shift or they're still catching up to that transition, we need to hook them back in. And then again, opportunities within each of those 10-minute chunks to have some quiet time for reflection is also valuable. So some ideas here on ways that you can hook them back and do this quickly to make the shifting of learner attention a little bit more effective. Well, first of all, we want to place our hooks between each chunk. So I'm going to move from one 10-minute chunk of content to a different focus of transition, but I've got to hook you back in order to help my learners make that transition and come along with me, right? The challenge of the 10-minute chunk and the transition in learner focus is that every time you shift your focus, there's a chance for somebody to wander, right? Think about trying to herd a group of 5-year-olds from one side of a room to another, right? When we're moving, our attention gets focused on shiny things. Instead of really the task at hand, we get distracted by all of these new things that we're noticing. And the same thing happens in the learning process for adults. Sometimes when we make a transition, we have to be very intentional to make sure people come along with us. But these are a few examples of ways that you can hook people and pull them back into the next chunk. Any connection to an emotion is going to be helpful. Any ways that we can draw on prior experiences and connect to new ideas through case studies or short anecdotal stories or examples from the workplace, etc. You don't need me to read that entire list to you. But think about packaging your content not only with the chunks, but also with a hook at the beginning of each new chunk. And then finally, if we want to really help people learn for the purpose of transferring new knowledge, we have to pull in real world problems. Problems make learning relevant. Problems help learners connect their prior experiences to new ideas. So introducing a challenge. Here's an example of one way that I did that today. Many of you remember the example I shared of running over the cat, and how do we get the attention of the person who is dealing with an injured cat attending our session? Well, that's a problem, right? We've all experienced something like that. Nancy shared an example of the volunteer that sometimes takes over and steers the entire focus to a completely different place than where we wanted to go. Those are real problems that we encounter in the learning environment. So anything we can do as we're introducing new ideas to bring real world problems into the learning, that's going to help your learners think about, how can I take this new knowledge and apply it in my life? Because they are already thinking about their problems. So, wow, that was a whirlwind hour of a lot of me talking and hopefully some of you absorbing. Let me stop my share here and ask what questions, reactions, or ideas you might have related to this concept of transfer for learning. What can I clarify for you? What experiences have you had that you might be willing to share? Rhonda, could I call on you to share what's on your mind right now?
Sure. Yeah, I guess right now I'm probably following kind of what you just were telling us about the recency and concept, and just really kind of thinking, I'm going to be teaching again on Monday, how I can pull in some of these relevant things to make it more in tune to what people are experiencing with I work with veterans in this particular class, and how I can change my content up a little bit to make it really, I guess, more relevant to what they're dealing with. They live in a transitional housing place, and how am I going to make that a little bit more relevant so they can be more engaged and see that, it's important to them, the learning.
Yeah. Rhonda, thank you. That's a great example of really focusing in on what are the learner experiences when you're working with veterans. it is really difficult to anticipate what their experiences are that they're bringing to this learning environment. But giving them the opportunity to connect to those is valuable. Thank you for sharing that. Jared, you posted a few things here. I want to give you a chance to kind of explain a bit further.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll mention those and then we can hang around if we have a few more minutes. But thank you all, and thank you, Dr. Washburn, for your time and your presentation today. Really do appreciate that. I know I've gained a few concepts that I want to work in, certainly to some of my sessions. I did post a few links. That first one that's not hyperlinked, but it is a link. That's our main landing page. You can get information about the series. The second one is the direct link to Dr. Washburn's previous video on effective learner engagement. The third one is our next session, which is on whole farm planning, integrating healthcare, health insurance, and childcare. So planning for the 21st century on the farm. And then we do have an evaluation link there as well. I will send a follow-up email with the recording to this session, along with those links as well, but I wanted to get them in here. So please take a few minutes if you get that eval link to give us your thoughts. And again, just thank you very much, Dr. Washburn. Thank you all for being here, being an effective or engaged audience. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And Jared, I did just drop my email in. If there are ideas that I presented very quickly here in an hour that I could further clarify, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm not just your partner in these presentations. I'm happy to assist however I can as you are working on your next opportunity for learning. So thank you so much for your engagement in ACEL 2 Extension. Please let us know what we can do to help you better inform your practice. Thanks for all you do.
Thanks, everyone.
And just